Hi, everybody. I'm going to get started because I have a lot to say that's not the artist talk, so we're going to get to the artist talk faster. First, a fire announcement. So in the event of a fire alarm, please proceed calmly to a nearby exit, leave the building, and move away from the door. We do not have floor lights, so please take a moment to note the location of nearby exits and be aware that the way you entered may not be the most direct way out. Sitting or standing in the aisles and doorways is not permitted, and of course, smoking is not allowed inside any university building. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Heather Bhandari, Adjunct Lecturer in Visual Arts, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our fourth artist lecture of the 2023-2024 school year, and the first one of this semester. So thanks for coming out in the cold. Tonight, I am so pleased to introduce you to Summer Wheat, whose range of work has mesmerized me for over a decade. It's been such a pleasure to watch her work grow in scale, media, and content, from the juicy, goopy paintings I saw in Boston circa 2010s, which I loved, to the expansive tapestry-like paintings, jewelry, ceramics, furniture that she's known for now. She's an artist who translates the language of painting and weaving to everything she does. Before we go any further, I would like to begin with a living land acknowledgement. Brown University is built on what is now called College Hill, part of the unceded ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. Indigenous people from many nations, near and far, live, study, and work in Providence today. The amplification of Native voices and histories is crucial to rectifying the many violent legacies of colonialism, and we gratefully acknowledge the ongoing critical contributions of Indigenous people within this university, across the state, and across the nation. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge that we are connected by a campus that relied on the African slave trade in the Americas, and there are buildings on campus constructed by enslaved people. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land we are speaking from today. These acknowledgements and much more commit us to a lifetime of decolonial and anti-racist work. Okay. Now, I would like to thank Ed Osborne, the Chair of Visual Arts, Christine Dodd, Winnie Geyer, CJ Liu, and Media Services up there in the back for facilitating this evening's event. A few more things before Summer gets to the stage. First, please do not record this event. We value and respect the IP of our visiting artists, and we will post our recording with their permission in the coming weeks. Still shots are great. Just please tag at Visual Arts, at Brown Visual Art, and at Summer Wheat Lillian. Second, after Summer's presentation, there will be a Q&A, and there are 2 microphones. We're going back to the microphones in the aisles. So 1, 2, when Summer is done speaking, line up and ask your questions. There will be at least 10 minutes of questions at the end, so think about that as she's talking. So now for our fabulous guest, Summer Wheat. Summer Wheat was born in 1977 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She's known for her vibrant paintings, multifaceted sculptures, and immersive installations that weave together the history of materiality, figuration, and abstraction in both fine art and craft milieus. Each series engages individual and collective human experiences drawn from historical and contemporary sources, mediated through a variety of references ranging from ancient art and medieval tapestries to etchings from the Renaissance to modern abstractions. Summer's work examines various manifestations of labor, leisure, commerce, and class through the depiction of numerous figures and archetypes, such as farmers, hunters, beekeepers, gardeners, weavers, bankers, and movie stars. The artist's densely populated scapes envision worlds where time seems to have collapsed and every person, regardless of social status, occupies a shared equal space in which both labor and leisure are paths to healing humanity. Using a tongue-in-cheek type of humor inspired by comic strips, Summer subverts conventional hierarchical structures and stereotypes to create more expansive depictions of daily life throughout history. And I'm going to add that her textured pieces are so compelling in person that even the seasoned art viewer wants to touch them. No matter how flat and graphic the images are, they welcome you. So now please join me in welcoming Summer Wheat.
Hi there. I'm going to move this up. I just want to say a few things. First of all, thank you so much, Heather Bandari, for bringing me here today. I've known Heather since 2012 and showed in a group show at Mixed Screens when she had a gallery in Chelsea in 2012. So we go way back, and it's really fun to kind of like come see her in these different contexts. We've explored a lot of different worlds together, so I appreciate you bringing me here, and thank you for having me. I also feel like it's important to note that none of this work would be possible without the help of so many supportive people throughout my life, and studio assistants and galleries and museums that have all collaborated and really been there for me in all ways. So this definitely doesn't happen just because I'm here. Like, there's a lot of people involved, and unfortunately can't all be represented in this moment, but I just want to make sure that they're noted. Let's see. So anyways, I'm deeply honored to be here tonight. I've worked with many Brown students over the years that have come and assisted me in the studio, or that I've shared a connection with over the years. I don't know what just happened. I lost. But I always find Brown students to be the most unique and exciting thinkers that I've encountered. So I'm deeply honored to speak to you tonight and visit your school and get to know you better from where you're starting. So thank you so much. I always like to start my lectures by sort of talking about where it all started. I really decided that I wanted to be an artist when I was 6 years old, and I was pretty much obsessed with art since I was really young. And the first time I really encountered any kind of art was through an animator who visited my school. And all he had was like a white pad of paper and a pencil, and he drew rabbits on the page and then made this little flip book for us. And I was a very shy kid and like super quiet, and I was standing in the back of the room, and I remember seeing what he was doing from a distance, and I like elbowed everyone to get out of my way, and I got really aggressive, and I got as close to the page as I possibly could because I literally thought that he was performing some kind of magic trick. I was entranced by the white page and the pencil. I still remember the pencil gliding across and the texture of the paper, and I couldn't figure out like how those two textures and these lines were coming together to create something that was moving. And so it was really from there that I remember consciously making a decision that I wanted to be an artist, or that I wanted to learn the language of how that worked. And so I always had white paper and pens or pencils, and I would draw like in the car with my dad. I remember looking at, the air conditioner vents and trying to decipher if, the angles within the vents were concave or convex, and I would look at the little triangles inside of them and try and understand like how these shapes were coming together to formulate an image. So my obsession with this language came about at a very early age, and I kind of have had the same drive or passion for understanding the language ever since. Like, it's always been a very primary part of my life. As Heather mentioned, I grew up in Oklahoma, and it was before the internet. It was before a lot of awareness of many aspects of where I'm from. And so I didn't have really any exposure to art that we have today, or that one would have access to today. So a lot of the images that I looked at were from like Lisa Frank folders. And I remember like staring at them and trying to like decipher how this paw, for example, like turned in like to a paw, and I would try to draw those lines. And I had like my own little world in my bedroom of drawings, and really trying to use Prismacolor pencils to make these gradations of color. Oops. In high school, strangely, we had like no access to art history, like traditional Western art history. Most of the magazines and the art books in our classrooms were Native American. And so my impression of what an artist was always Native American. And I would look at these Navajo blankets and I would try to draw them exactly. And I would do like a lot of meditative work, like looking at how the different shapes came together, much like I did looking at my dad's air conditioning vents. Like it was the same kind of space that I would go into where I was trying to put triangles and colors together to create a pattern. And alongside that, I also had like all of these figures that I was drawing from that had these expressions and this like soul energy that I was drawn to, that I was always trying to like capture or bring out to the surface of the page. In Oklahoma, there are a lot of paintings, like in the state capitol building. Like that would be a place that I would, for example, be exposed to a painting. And as a teenager, young teen, I would always look at them and think that there was something wrong with them. And like I was very aware that what was being portrayed to me was not actually the truth. Because in a lot of these paintings that were on the government building walls, there were like these images of like a white man and a Native American coming to an agreement together. They're shaking hands with their kids playing in the background. And it was kind of like really the moment that I was inspired to like leave Oklahoma and like venture out from where I was from, because I felt like the stories that were being told to me were not the actual true stories. This is another kind of like point of interest that I had, which was surface qualities. I was always fascinated by how paintings like this would have like the texture of suede, or the blanket, the velvety blanket, or the texture of the skin was always like highly rendered and articulate, and I would always try and like render that same kind of surface quality so that I could make something on the page and look like it was actually, you know, what it was. And as I graduated from that point in my life and I moved on and I went to school, an undergraduate, which was kind of a haphazard experience for me, but I learned more about Western art and artists like Vermeer, and I sort of noticed the same kind of things that were happening on the page, just in a different way. But I was always really drawn to the surface of a painting and painters who could render like something that looked exactly or felt exactly like what it was. Like in a Vermeer painting, you know, the wood really looks like, you know, something you would want to put your hand on, or a feather really looks very soft, or the essence of the figure really is breathing life into the page. So I was always fascinated by how these surfaces were created in painting. Fast forward many years, a decade maybe. In 2005, I was visiting the High Museum in Atlanta, and I happened across this exhibit of the Geesbin quilts. And it was the first time that I had seen these quilts or heard about them, and I stayed in that exhibit for probably 6 hours. I was just completely enthralled. I would just keep circling the room and go back and forth and sit in front of these pieces, and I was just mesmerized by them. And the thing that captured my attention was the surfaces of these blankets and the energies that they held. For example, like a lot of these blankets were made from the denim of one of the quilter's husband's jeans that he wore in the factory, or you could see cigarette burns in the blankets because they were actually like used as blankets. So there was this felt energy in the works that I was really drawn to. And I liked the fact that these blankets were actually used in real life, and they were never meant to be in the context of a museum. And so to me, they held this energy of a life force within them that spoke to me, because it was like they rendered a life beyond, like outside of a studio, or having some kind of rigorous dialogue that didn't have anything to do with the feeling of the work. And so I really took those pieces in such a significant way. They honestly changed my life. The other thing I was really drawn to about these pieces was the invented abstraction. They're just incredible how invented these worlds are within the blankets, and they're very intuitive, and the colors are incredibly original. And so I was just so drawn to like the originality and the uniqueness of each one, because they had like this very specific individual voice. On the other side of the wall, there were these other paintings that were from like more traditional Western art history. And it was like the permanent collection of the High Museum. And so after I spent all of these hours looking at the Giesbin quilts, I wandered into the room with the permanent collection. And it was like such a strange occurrence that day, because it was like this weird encounter I had where I was like in this world of this felt experience with these pieces that were never really meant to be shown in a museum. And then I was looking at these Jonathan Laskers, these Peter Halleys, these Rothkos, and these paintings that were made from a dialogue from a very academic state of mind. And I was just as equally attracted to them, but I could feel the difference. But it was just like a really interesting comparison and contrast that was happening at the museum that way, because there was just this one wall that was dividing these two worlds, and they were kind of trying to speak the same way through this invented geometric abstraction, but they were coming from very different places. So I started doing a lot of comparisons between like the Giesbin quilts and abstract expressionism, like Rothko. And like this comparison between a Giesbin quilt and a Peter Halley. They kind of like convey the same idea of like isolation, or this really simplified color that really locks you into the space. So that was right at the point that I finished graduate school, and I went back to my studio at that point, and I sat on my studio floor, and I had this other sort of conscious moment and decision that I made where I realized that I wanted to like sew with paint, that I wanted to somehow like turn this idea of like quilt making or like something handmade or felt into string. And I had no idea. Like I remember like kind of using a stick, and I was mixing like a gallon of liquid paint, and I was like running the string of paint up, and I was like, how do I turn this into like a different form? How do I turn this into an actual string? And then how can I sew with it on the canvas? So I spent several years after graduate school really exploring how to do that, and it was kind of an exciting time that, you know, I look back on now as thrilling, but then it was just terrifying every day because I had no idea what I was doing or why I felt so drawn to do it. It's much easier to see in hindsight. It was just like there was an equation that I felt like came before me, which was, how do you sew with paint? So it was from there that I embarked upon this journey where I really explored the material of paint, and I came to this idea of like really putting painting, drawing, and sculpture together. So at the time I was looking at like a lot of lace patterns, and I would just try and decipher all of the lines and how they were coming together to create a pattern. And so I had these two kind of worlds happening where on one hand I was like trying to decipher the lace patterns, and then on the other hand I was like painting like a painter, like a figurative painter. So I was trying to integrate these two worlds that were very different from one another. And I had no idea how I wanted to like bridge that gap between something that was like very linear into something that was very open and loose. This was from like 2007, so a couple of years later. This was the first painting that I felt like I made where I was like, okay, I've delineated this process somehow. I've been able to like create these gradations. This looks like a crocheted subject, but it's still paint. There was like some figurative element, like I was thinking of this as like a veil on someone's head. So I felt like I had like accomplished something in this painting where because prior to that I had made so many failed paintings, and it was like a constant existential crisis of just like not knowing like why I was so determined to make this direction happen or how to actually like execute what I was saying. And it was just like this moment that I felt like, okay, I sort of have my bearings here. I kind of know what I'm doing. Alongside all of this, it's funny because like to condense everything that's happened, I've had so many multiple facets to my process that I hope one day it makes sense. But alongside of this, I was working at a trolley shop. I was like working as not a tour guide, but like a ticket seller for a trolley place part-time. And I was sitting at an office desk most of the day. And so I started utilizing a lot of the office tools as like ways to make art, because I was just desperate to like I was always wanting to be in the studio. So I started this series of office works, and it was here that I really felt like, okay, this is where the line is really coming into place. This is my voice. I know this is the direction I want to go with the line quality. But I didn't want to just paint the lines on canvas. I wanted them to be sculptural somehow. Like I wanted them to be sewn. So it was like, I always felt like I was trying to solve this math equation that had many different aspects, and I always wanted to get to the other side of that equal sign. And a lot of like these images were coming from the figurative works I was looking at, like George Condo and Carol Dunham, Carol Dunham at the time was early 2000s. He was really new to the painting world, and I was so enthralled by his work because I felt like he really captured this idea of like cartoon and violence and this individual like nature of the shapes that he was utilizing. And these invented characters and these worlds just blew my mind. So I really looked at his work a lot and tried to like harness a little bit of what he was talking about. The other artist that was really influential is Sue Williams, like really early Sue Williams works. Now she essentially works a lot just with lines, but her earlier pieces had a lot to do with very feminist content, and I found them to be very visceral, and I was always attracted to artworks that had kind of a visceral nature to them, that were saying something that like was deeply personal, or maybe like not allowed to be said out loud. And so someone like Sue Williams was also a part of this path. And then at this point, there was this other part of the equation that came into play where I decided that I really wanted to somehow bridge the gap in my painting between de Kooning and Seurat, because I felt like that would be the most impossible thing that any painter could do. And for whatever reason, I've just always wanted to do things that are impossible. So I really was interested in the physicality of the de Kooning. Like, I loved, how he was expressing himself with the paint, almost as a sculptor. And then I loved the finite point of Seurat. So this was like an additional kind of aspect to the equation I was building when I was trying to sew with paint. I wanted these elements to also come into play. And then later on, many years later, I kind of arrived at that with the painting process I'm primarily working with now. I thought through this lecture, usually I talk mostly about painting, but I'm going to turn the page into where I'm at now, which is a little bit into the future, and it's engaged more in like actual space and architecture. But essentially, the painting process that I've been working with for several years is one that utilized this idea of de Kooning and Seurat coming together in one piece. So on the left side, you can see the back side of one of my paintings, and then on the right side, you can see a small segment of a de Kooning painting. So especially in person, you can kind of see the physicality of how these two ideas come together. And then when you look at the surface of one of my paintings, you can see how, like, when I push the paint through the mesh, each of these little dots is portrayed through the screen, which I'll get to in a minute. But I just wanted to kind of like give you the preface to the main components of my painting practice now. In 2013, I really took out art history, like in terms of painting and sculpture, and any kind of like traditional art history out of my picture. And I started to really look at objects made by anonymous people, like spoons or shoes or artifacts that had nothing to do with anyone in particular, like making a piece of art or how we would conceive of a piece of art. And I started spending a lot of time at the Pratt Library, and I was like at this moment of really wanting to deconstruct everything that I had just built. And so I started looking at these shoes and spoons from like the 17th century and just finding these avenues of contemporary ideas held within these historical artifacts. And I found that to be like a really fascinating place to like explore, because they just had this aspect to them that was incredibly timeless, and shapes that were intriguing to me as a sculpture would be intriguing to me. So at the time I started building these libraries in my studio with all of the photocopies I was making at the Pratt Library, and it was just like this reference material sort of box. There were several boxes of different fabrics and spoons and things from daily life that are used in like a utilitarian way. And prior to that, I was working in like isolation. Like I would get so nervous when I would have a studio visit, or I didn't really know how to bring anyone into my process, because I was so deeply engaged with trying to sort out how to solve these problems that it was weird to me to have someone else's energy in my space or their eyes on my work, because I knew that I was in a deep experiment and that whatever I was doing wasn't going to look a certain way. And I felt like that it was like such a strange occurrence with like other friends or the graduate school I went to. It was like everything was supposed to be experimental, but it was also supposed to like look a certain way during the experiment. It was supposed to like look beautiful or have aspects to it that would be aesthetic or conceptual. And like I wanted to be in a space where I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know like how things were looking, and that they didn't have traditional like ideas of beauty behind them. And so I really like sectored myself off from like having a lot of exposure to what was happening internally in my studio until this moment when I started working with collaborators or other students or assistants. And so I started incorporating like more of a teamwork into the studio, which was like a whole other way of working for me, where I just started like really taking the paint off of the canvas and using it as sculpture, and it required like other vehicles of facility in order for that to happen. And I started mold making and making like I was asking all these questions like, how do I make a sock out of paint? How do I make a rock out of paint? How do I make seeds? And I had these drawers of different molds that I was making, where I was really trying to like build an environment of paint objects so that I could like somehow walk into a painting, or somehow like take the painting out of the canvas and then bring it into physical reality. And I think that interest really spawns from like feeling as though we're entering into another dimension. We're like getting out of like a 2D space, like we're entering into a virtual space. At least back then it felt like very new, and virtual reality was just starting to come into our lives, and social media and all of those things were like changing the way in which we were oriented to space. And so I think that my reaction to that was really trying to like change the way that I was exploring space on the canvas and taking it off entirely, and really trying to figure out what I could do with paint and change the reality that you were looking at with these objects. It was like looking at a Bernard painting, except for it was like in 3D. This was like a really exciting time in my studio, because I have like no pictures of it really, because I didn't care about photographing anything. I was just like, it was almost like all of these different ideas and methodologies were just falling out of my hands, because it had been a good decade up until that point that I was, working around the clock in my studio trying to figure out these equations that I had built. And it seemed as though like there was a form that started to come out that I couldn't almost like keep up with. So it was really a really fun time that there wasn't really necessarily like a concise result. I had an exhibit of these pieces, but it almost like didn't even matter, because it was just like the process itself and exploring all these different methods and finding them was like what really built the nest egg for the next 10 years. And one of the processes that came out of that moment was making the paintings, as I was mentioning before, where I push paint through like a wire mesh screen. And that came about just by asking these questions of like, how do I make a tapestry out of paint? And at the time, I had very limited resources, and I bought a lot of my art supplies at the dollar store. And so one night I had these little screens that you buy at the dollar store that you put like next to your air conditioner. And I had like a stack of them on the floor, and they were just sitting next to me, and I just started pushing paint through the wire mesh. And I also had like a pair of pantyhose that I'd bought at the dollar store, and I started like pushing the paint through the pantyhose and then twisting the toe and finding these little like pom-pom expressions. They looked like pom-poms or fabrics. And I got so excited. And at the time, I really knew like which dollar stores were open at what days and what times they closed in Brooklyn, and I would I bought a lot of things at the dollar stores. It was kind of my go-to for socks. I knew who had the best undergarments. I knew who had the best paints. So I ran to this dollar store that I knew would be open, and it was late at night, and I bought another stack of those screens, and I came back to my studio, and I was so excited, and it was just this moment where a lot of these explorations came together. So at the time I was really thinking about oh, this is kind of like a deconstructed painting. I took off the stretcher bar of another painting that was stretched canvas, and I dismantled it and I put it on the wall. And so I was thinking about the stretcher on the wall, and then the metaphor that tends to be used in painting where the painting is a window into another world, and these were window screens. And then there was no canvas. I was just working with the wall and the stretcher. And so that's how these paintings started. And then they kind of evolved, the stretcher bars evolved into a more substantial rack. And now this is similar to what I have in my studio, where I'm really circling the paintings. And I feel that's another aspect to this particular process, is that it's a very physical experience. When I'm making them, I circle them, and there's a lot of movement and ways in which they're worked from the back and the front at the same time. The other point of perspective that I felt this process brought out into the open was just this idea of filling in a grid, and thinking of the grid as the way in which we found perspective, or 2D perspective. And so I thought it was just interesting to kind of take the paint and push it through the substrate of a grid, and find this new perspective through a grid. It was another element to the process. So originally I was just thinking of this as this is how I'm gonna make a paint tapestry. So I had a rug that my parents gave me that I took to my studio, and I started using it as a point of reference. And I just was thinking of these paintings will be rug paintings. I wasn't considering incorporating my own drawings into the imagery of them. So this is an example of one of the first rug paintings that I made, where at the time I was just literally pushing white paint through the back and then using a paintbrush to paint from the front. I was thinking they would be watercolor tapestries. That's a close-up. And then this was one of the early pieces from that era. So you can kind of see the pixelized image, and then I showed at the beginning of the lecture, the backside looks a lot like a de Kooning. So it was here I kind of started to resolve this need that I had to gratify. And I started looking back into this reservoir of different images that I had selected at the Pratt Library of these different tapestries, and I started thinking I guess I could make an image-based tapestry. So I went back to the drawings. These drawings that were on register tape that I showed you earlier were also on paper. So throughout the entire lifespan of all of these other paint experiments that were happening, I always had these pen and paper drawings, and I really liked always making drawings on paper because they're very transportable. I could take them anywhere. I always have a sketchbook with me. Even when I'm at the doctor's office, I'm drawing. So now I have an iPad that I work with, but it's I just liked the way in which you can move this process to different contexts and always have something to make. So this is an example of a drawing, and when I realized that I could make that into a painting using this process. So this was another like turning point that started a direction for me where I really started putting together like drawing, painting, and sculpture, which was one of the original equations I was trying to solve. So again, you can see the texture of the painting. And then in 2017, 18, I was invited by Heather Bandari to do a show at Smackmelon, where she was working as a curator. And it was at the time that Trump was inaugurated. And I was realizing that this show is going to happen in a year from now, and that we as a culture would really need a place of refuge to like rest from the political climate that we were about to embark upon. And so I used the space as a garden, and I wanted it to like create a refuge for people to have like rest from the outer elements, because I suspected they would be quite harsh, which they were, as we all know. And it was here that I really utilized a lot of these methodologies that I was talking about earlier, where I was exploring like how to make a window out of paint, how to make a tapestry out of paint. And I wanted there to be like this day and night garden motif in the space. And this was the first like immersive environment that I built that I felt like was successful, or also incorporated this idea of drawing, painting, and sculpture coming together in one place. And originally I had asked Heather if I could put a pool in the middle of the gallery, and so there would be like this reflection of day and night coming together within the water, but that didn't work out. So I made these benches that you can see here that had like a really reflective black lacquer paint, so that you could kind of like take in the environment of the garden and also like reflect on day and night, whichever way you were facing, you would take in whatever side of the day or night exhibit you would be in. And so these were the drawings that I used to create the windows. And it was here that I like really started to hone in on my practice in terms of like using a lot of preliminary drawings to dictate larger spaces. So like I had no idea, for example, if these windows would actually work. Like I made these drawings and I couldn't create those images on the floor of my studio because I was limited by space. So there was this risk factor that kind of like incorporated itself into making these kinds of installations that also exists in the painting process, because once I push the paint through the grid, there's no turning back. Like I only have like one chance to get it right. And so there's like a lot of preparation in my practice that I am always taking this chance of like preparing and then hoping that it works out on a large scale. And I like having this sort of responsibility of taking on scale in this way, because it just feels as though there's so many different challenges and problems to solve just in terms of space. So this is an example of one of those windows, and I used like acrylic mediums and resin to create this idea and environment of like a stained glass environment. I was actually thinking about them like as woodcuts, like I wanted them to render this idea of woodcut. So it was like the windows were meant to be, you know, this place in which the sun came through to activate them. And it was like the sun and the wood coming together to create the image. And then the benches were like this reflecting pool. And then there was a night garden painting, which was like a filled-in grid of a starscape. So this is, again, what the day side looked like. And then that was the night garden, which was made with the painting technique with the screen. And then this was also the first time I had the opportunity to think about sculpture and like utilizing this idea of the viewer having a place to rest or a place to touch. Because a lot of my works are very textural, people have a tendency to want to like hug them or run their hands across them. And so I wanted to provide, in addition to having a space of reflection physically, I wanted to have a place of like reflection internally through this idea of texture. And so the surface of these pieces is very smooth, and these are gardeners that are pulling flowers from the earth that were made from drawings. So it was here that I sort of found this way of working where I was like, oh, everything can come from drawings, and the translation of those is just a matter of space. Like however the space is rendered is where I'm going to, how I'm going to make the drawings come to life. So you can see some of the preliminary drawings here. And then this is my studio now. And you can see the scale that the paintings are taking on. It's just like still working in this way of moving back and forth from the front to the back side of the work. And then once Trump actually got into office, I started making a series of beekeepers. And that had to do with just this idea of danger that we were embarking upon, that I felt like we were in a constant state of danger, and from one minute to the next, you didn't know if you were going to get stung, and it was super chaotic, and there were so many bees that you couldn't see past anything. It was just like a swarm of chaos. And so a lot of these paintings came about during his presidency, and they spoke about like what I was experiencing. There's another beekeeper. And then these are dancing beekeepers. So you can see the texture of these and how the detail kind of develops. The color becomes a little bit more monochromatic, and the shape becomes an important aspect to the work. So like when you're standing at a distance, they really look like silhouetted figures. This piece is probably 15 or 16 feet wide by 7 feet tall. So these figures are really larger than life. And they're sectioned in a way where they look very much about shape and form. And then when you come up close, they have all of this detail to kind of encounter. So the physical nature in which they speak to has to do with this like at a distance and close up spatial connection. And this is an example of what me pushing those beekeepers from behind the screen looks like. I have another segment to this lecture, but I think we're out of time, so I feel like it's a good place to stop here. So thank you so much.
Hi, Summer.
Hi.
Other people can feel comfortable asking questions too. I have a question. As it was dawning on me, I've always just known you as a painter, and I know you make jewelry, you make furniture, you make all kinds of other things. But I'm curious, when you were looking at the shoes, or you were growing up with the Native American tapestries or all these quilts, why did you stick to paint? You were solving all these problems. It would have been maybe easier if you gave up the paint part. So what kept you a painter?
I think the opportunity for color, just the array of color and the, going from watercolor to acrylic to oil, like all of those dimensions of color that can be conveyed through that liquid. It was always important to me to have some kind of like liquid that turned into form. But outside of that, I think that probably for 15 years I was highly limited in my space and resources, and so sculpture itself felt like a whole other degree of things that I would need, like a foundry or tools, and there were aspects to sculpture that I couldn't necessarily like get into, and so I'm like a sculptor in the guise of a painter, and I think I just created sculptural paintings for those reasons.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Lyric. Nice to
Nice
meet
to
you.
meet you.
I had a question about, or I was wondering if you could speak more to what your artistic practice looked like as you were coming out of your undergrad. I'm a senior now, and I'm hoping to work as an artist in the future. So I was wondering if you had any advice, or if you could speak more to that.
Sure. I would say that a lot of my undergraduate career was very haphazard, as I mentioned before, mainly because I just didn't have a traditional notion of what art history was or what an artist in history was supposed to be or do. There was no context for me, so I thought about like Madonna as an artist, like I didn't know, or Bob Dylan, and so I took a lot of Greyhound buses. This is probably really bad advice, so I wouldn't take it. But I took a lot of Greyhound buses around the country, and I just like wanted to see the country, and I had a sketchbook and a pencil, and I just drew all around and took odd jobs, and I was like a door-to-door canvasser at one point in Pittsburgh, and I never told my parents that's what I was doing, but I was like literally going door-to-door like as a canvasser for an environmental rights group at the time. And so the hours were, you know, from 1 until 8 p.m. And so I would wake up at 7 a.m. and work from 7 a.m. until 12. And so I had like a block of time. So I kind of like always tried to find jobs that were outside of the art world, because I found that like if I waited tables or if I had something that like would provide enough for me to pay my rent, I would typically be able to like sector in time to make my work. And so like a lot of my 20s up until I was like 25 or 26, I was a waitress, I did mural paintings, and I worked like a lot of odd jobs and traveled the country and was kind of like incredibly like randomly focused on things. But I still made a lot of work, and I worked just as much as I do now, actually. Like I worked every day on my art. It was just that there was no like, I didn't take a traditional path in any kind of way. I just wanted to make enough money to survive so that I could, and do it in a way that would give me enough time to make my work. So I think as long as you can figure something out, and I also like lived in random places in the country like Pittsburgh, where it was enough of a city where I was stimulated and there were museums and interesting things to get behind, but it wasn't as expensive as like living in New York City. Like I was terrified to move to New York City because I had no idea how I would support myself there, and I didn't want to get swallowed by just like working in a never-ending wheel. So I always tried to like find places in the country that I could live without having too many expenses, and work jobs and like know that I was doing that for a couple of years, and that was okay, and that I didn't need to have studio visits, and that I didn't need anybody to know who I was, and that I didn't need to like claim myself in any kind of way, which I don't know if that was like specific to, you know, the 90s and the early 2000s, because now we have Instagram and there's so many different channels in which one can show their art. But for me, I feel like fortunate, and I'm glad that I took the route I did, because I really didn't have studio visits or start showing my work until much later in life, because I wanted that time to, like, as I said before, experiment and not have the work like look a certain way. I didn't want to be limited by an aesthetic, and I wanted that experiment to be as real as possible and not be connected to anything. So it was like I found little groups of artist friends that were of the same mind, and we had these little communities together where I felt like I was in a dialogue, but you know, I wasn't necessarily like on a traditional path.
Hello.
Hi.
I really liked hearing you talk about creating objects and spaces with paint and color. And I was just wondering if you had ever experimented with using the paper making process or painting with pulped paper and any other interesting mediums that you used while you were trying to find your footing.
It's kind of like cooking for me. Like, I can't cook anything traditional. Like, if you asked me to cook a chicken, I would get so nervous. But if you wanted me to make like a raw food diet pizza, I would get really into it because I like the dehydrator and I like mixing the flaxseed in the water and like some kind of invented thing. So I did try to make paper a few times, but like for whatever reason, it doesn't sync up with me. Like anything that, you know, a process that's already in place, like I couldn't adapt to it. Like there's something about what I feel excited about is like exploring how to do something in a new way. And so for me, it was like I couldn't get into the process that was already regimented, but I did try. And I love the idea, like, and the texture and all of the different facets of that.
Hi. I'm Kiki. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm quite into environmental art, and I noticed you use a lot of natural objects or natural subjects in your work, like the bees and then the garden. I also looked up some of your other works, like with fish on it, which I was really intrigued by. So I was wondering if you had any particular connection to nature or any reason why you decided to use those as subjects in your work.
I mean, I do believe in environmental causes, and I stand behind all of that. But for me, it was more about like gender issues that were happening culturally and just internally at the time. Like, and I felt like, for example, a lot of the images of beekeepers were typically male, and so I wanted to make an inventory of beekeepers that were female, or fishers. Like, take these kinds of like tropes from art history that were typically seen from a male perspective and creating these images of women who would do things that men would typically do. So a lot of those environments have to do with just wrestling with these tropes from art history that I wanted to like reconfigure and hope that I built a new thread into them.
Thank you so much.
Hello. I don't mean to speak for you, but my overall impression of your progression, your experimentation, just seems like it was like a very frantic sort of desire, something that you weren't quite sure. And just from that, do you feel you've approached like the solutions to your equations, or is there still stuff that you think that you haven't figured out yet?
I feel like I'm always explore. If I solve an equation, then I'm gonna come up with another reason to solve another problem, or like come up with another set of equations, like the ones I'm working with now. Like, I think I'm just very vested in the exploration. Like, there is a lot of frantic energy in that, but I think in the pursuit of, I hesitate to say invention because I don't necessarily see them as invented processes, but like there is an aspect to that in the exploration of working with the tools in an unorthodox way.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you guys so much. Thanks.